I dare to listen this. The House That Whispers. The town of Black Hollow had a secret. It wasn't the kind people whispered about in taverns or gossiped over in hushed voices at the market. No, this secret was older than any living soul could remember, buried deep in the roots of history, like a curse that refused to die. At the heart of this secret was the Harrowick Manor. Perched on the highest hill, overlooking the town like a forgotten god, the manor had stood for over 3 centuries. Its windows were hollow eyes, its wooden frame a rib cage long abandoned by whatever had once lived inside. The locals spoke of strange sounds, whispers that carried on the wind, doors slamming when no one was inside, and a terrible weeping that echoed through the valley on the coldest nights. Nobody dared to go near it. Until now. Chapter 1. The Dare That Started It. All Elijah Moore had never been one to believe in ghost stories. At 17, he considered himself too old for such nonsense. He had seen enough horror movies to know that hauntings were just tricks of the mind, fueled by fear and folklore. So when his friends dared him to spend one night in Harrowick Manor, he laughed. "I'll do it," he said, confidently, taking a swig of his drink. "And I'll prove to you all that there's nothing in that house but dust and old furniture." His best friend, Mark, smirked. "All right, tough guy, but you have to stay until sunrise. No sneaking out." Elijah shrugged. "Easy." The group met at the gates just before midnight. The iron bars were rusted, bent as if something had once tried to force its way out. A biting wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, something rotten. "This place gives me the creeps," murmured Sarah, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "Don't be a baby," Elijah teased. He pushed open the gates, which groaned like a dying man. The air inside felt different, thicker, heavier, as if the house itself was aware of their presence. He turned to his friends. "See you at sunrise." With that, he stepped inside. The first hour. Whispers in the dark. The house welcomed him with silence. Dust coated every surface, disturbed only by his footprints. The grand chandelier overhead was wrapped in cobwebs, its once glorious crystals now dulled with age. The air smelled of mildew and something acrid like burnt wood. Elijah took out his flashlight and swept it across the foyer. "Nothing to be scared of," he muttered. A whisper slithered through the darkness. His breath hitched. He spun around, shining the flashlight in all directions. The house remained still, but the air felt different, charged, as if something had moved just beyond his sight. He took a deep breath and laughed. "Just the wind." But deep inside, something in his gut twisted in warning. The second hour. The locked room. Elijah wandered through the halls, peering into abandoned rooms. Some still had furniture covered in white sheets, like forgotten ghosts, waiting to be remembered. Others were empty, their wallpaper peeling like rotting flesh. Then he found the door. Unlike the others, this one was locked. The brass handle was tarnished, but something about it felt off, as if it was warmer than it should be. A scratching sound came from the other side. Elijah's breath caught. He pressed his ear against the wood. The scratching grew louder, more desperate. It sounded like nails raking against the surface. His pulse pounded. Suddenly, bang! Something slammed against the door from the other side. Elijah stumbled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs. He shone his flashlight on the door, half expecting it to burst open. But the house was silent again, for now. The third hour. The portraits that moved. Determined to keep going, Elijah moved deeper into the house. The long hallways seemed to stretch endlessly, each step echoing against the rotting wooden floor. The air grew colder, pressing against his skin like unseen hands. Then he saw the paintings. Lining the corridor were portraits of people, men, women, and children, dressed in old-fashioned clothing. Their eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to follow him as he walked. He stopped in front of one, a tall man with a sharp, gaunt face. His eyes, black as ink, seemed to bore into Elijah's soul. He looked away for only a moment. When he looked back, the man's head had tilted slightly. Elijah's breath hitched. His flashlight trembled in his hand. He swore the painting had changed. He stepped back, glancing at the others. A woman in another portrait had turned her head slightly, her lips curling into the faintest of smiles. The child in the third portrait had no eyes now, only empty sockets staring back at him. Panic surged through him. He turned and ran. The fourth hour, the laughter from below. Elijah didn't stop until he reached the grand staircase leading down into the manor's basement. He didn't want to go down there, but something in the air had changed. It was pulling him forward. Then he heard it. A child's laughter. Software. Echoing from below. His flashlight flickered. The laughter grew closer. The sound of tiny, unseen feet pattered against the wooden floorboards. A shadow moved at the bottom of the stairs. Elijah's breathing turned ragged. Every rational part of his brain screamed at him to turn around, to leave the house, and never return. But something in the house didn't want him to leave. Something in the house wanted to play. The House That Never Lets Go. Chapter 1. The Invitation. The invitation arrived in an envelope with no return address. You were invited to spend one night at Blackwood Manor. If you last until sunrise, you will inherit the estate. No sender, no details, just those words in old, elegant handwriting. James Carter, a struggling journalist, stared at the letter in disbelief. Blackwood Manor was infamous, a decaying mansion hidden in the hills, rumored to be cursed. Over the years, every owner had vanished without a trace. The locals refused to go near it. A free house, though, too good to pass up. That night, James packed a flashlight, a camera, and a notebook, ready to document his experience. At exactly 11:59 p.m., he arrived at the towering gates of Blackwood Manor. The iron bars were twisted, as if something had tried to claw its way out. The wind whispered through the dead trees, carrying an eerie, rotting scent. He hesitated. Then, the gate creaked open on its own. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The door shut behind him, and the nightmare began. Chapter 2. The house is alive inside. The house breathed. The air was thick, heavy, with a scent of damp wood and something metallic. Blood? The grand chandelier overhead swayed slightly, though there was no wind. Cobwebs stretched like veins across the ceiling. James lifted his camera. The lens fogged up. A low creaking echoed from the walls. He turned, expecting to see something moving in the dark corners, but the house remained still. Then came the whispers, faint at first, like the wind murmuring through cracks. But as James moved deeper inside, and the voices became clearer, urgent, pleading, "Leave, run, he is watching." James's skin prickled. "Who's watching?" he whispered. No answer, only silence. Then, a shadow moved at the top of the staircase. Something was waiting upstairs, and it wanted him to follow. Chapter 3. The Room That Shouldn't Exist. James climbed the stairs, his heart hammering. The wooden steps groaned under his weight. At the end of the hall, a single door stood slightly ajar, James reached for the handle, and the door flung open on its own. Inside was a bedroom, untouched by time. The bed was neatly made, an old rocking chair swayed gently in the corner, and a fireplace crackled with fresh embers. But the house had been abandoned for decades. Then he saw it, a diary lying on the nightstand. James flipped it open. The last entry read, "He told me if I play the game, I can leave. But no one ever leaves. The house never lets go." Elizabeth Blackwood, 1876. James barely had time to process the words before the rocking chair stopped moving. Not slowed, not wobbled, stopped instantly. A shiver ran down his spine. He turned toward the door. It was closed, and behind him the bed creaked, like someone was lying down. James slowly turned around. The imprint of a body sank into the mattress. Then the covers peeled back, inch by inch. James bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. Then, from the empty bed, came a voice. "Don't play the game." The door burst open, and James ran. Chapter 4. The game begins. James's camera was shaking in his hands as he gasped for breath. Something was wrong with this house. He tried to find the front door, but it was gone. The hallway stretched endlessly, twisting into a maze of unfamiliar rooms. Then, the lights flickered, and the whispers returned. "Find the game. Play the game." James stumbled into the dining room, and on the table was a board game. The pieces were already set, the dice waiting. His name was carved into the wood. A new message appeared on the board. "Roll the dice, or stay forever." James's hands trembled. He had no choice. He picked up the dice and rolled. Chapter 5. The House's True Face. The dice clattered across the board. The walls groaned. The floor shook. A gust of cold air snuffed out the candles. Then the board spelled out his first challenge. "Find the child before she finds you." A child. James' breath hitched. Then he heard it. Soft, rapid footsteps. And a giggle. The temperature plummeted. James spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. At the edge of the room stood a little girl in a white nightgown. Her head was tilted. Her eyes, hollow black voids. Then she sprinted toward him. James grabbed the board, flipping it over. The girl vanished, but a new message burned itself into the wood. 1 challenge down. 3 to go. James's stomach twisted. He was trapped in the game, and it wasn't done with him yet. Chapter 6. The Final Challenge. James barely survived the second and third challenges, each more terrifying than the last. Now, only one remained. The board spelled it out. Survive until sunrise. Easier said than done. The house came alive. The walls cracked open like mouths, whispering, screaming, calling his name. Shadows stretched across the ceiling, forming skeletal hands that reached for him. He sprinted through the halls, the house shifting around him. Then, in the grand foyer, he saw it. The front door. It was open. James ran, but just as he reached the threshold, a hand grabbed his ankle. He fell, clawing at the floor. Something was pulling him back. James kicked, screamed, and then the sun rose. The hand vanished. The whispers stopped, and James collapsed outside, gasping for air. He had won, or so he thought. As he stumbled away, the front door slowly creaked open again, waiting for the next player. The House That Feeds. Prologue. The Vanishing. The last known owner of Ravenswood Manor was a man named Victor Langley. In 1893, he purchased the estate for his family. Within a year, every servant quit. His wife and children vanished without a trace. Langley was found wandering the streets months later, his eyes blank, whispering one thing: "The house is hungry." Then, one night, he walked into the mansion and was never seen again. The house remained abandoned for over a century. But some nights, the villagers swore they saw a flicker of candlelight in the windows. Some even claimed they heard laughter, but no one ever dared to go inside. Until now. Chapter 1. The Forgotten Estate. Nathan Hale wasn't afraid of ghost stories. He was a real estate investor, always searching for properties with hidden value. When he heard about Ravenswood Manor, he saw nothing but profit. Sure, it was abandoned. Sure, the locals warned him. But houses don't kill people. He signed the paperwork sight unseen. Then came the letter. It was waiting for him at his hotel room. No return address. A single piece of paper with elegant black ink. You must visit before you claim it. The house decides who stays. Nathan laughed, but deep inside, something unsettled him. That night, he drove up the long, winding path. By the time he arrived, his phone had lost service. The trees loomed over the road like watchful figures. Then he saw it. Ravenswood Manor. The mansion seemed to breathe. Its windows were hollow eyes, staring. The iron gate was already open, like it had been expecting him. Nathan stepped out of the car. The moment his foot touched the gravel, the front door creaked open on its own, welcoming him in, or trapping him inside. Chapter 2. The House Remembers. Inside, the air was heavy. It smelled of old wood, damp stone, and something else. Something rotten. Nathan turned on his flashlight. The grand chandelier overhead swung slightly. Footsteps echoed, but he wasn't moving. Nathan glanced at the floor. Dust covered everything. Yet, his footprints weren't the only ones. A second set of prints led deeper inside. Nathan's breathing grew unsteady. Something whispered from the shadows. "I remember you." He spun around. No one was there. He forced himself forward. Hallways stretched impossibly long. The portraits along the walls were covered in dust, but their eyes seemed to glisten. Then he reached the dining room and froze. The table that waits. The dining table was set. Plates, silverware, fresh food. Nathan's stomach twisted. How? Then he noticed the chairs. Each one had a name carved into it. Some names were old, their carvings faded. But at the very end of the table, a chair with his name. Nathan took a step back. The chair slid out. An invitation. His hands shook. Then, a shadow moved behind him. Nathan spun around. A mirror hung on the wall. His reflection wasn't looking at him. It was looking past him. Nathan turned, flashlight, trembling. And for the first time, he saw them. The people at the table. Dead. Rotting. Some missing eyes. Some frozen in silent screams. But one of them, a man in a Victorian suit, turned his head and whispered, "You need to leave before the house chooses you." Then, every candle in the room blew out, and something whispered in his ear. Too late. Chapter 3. The game begins. Nathan ran. Hallways twisted wrong. Doors slammed shut on their own. Then, he heard it. A child's laughter. He turned a corner and saw her. A little girl in a white dress. Her hair was matted, her face hidden. She whispered, "You have to play." Nathan's breath caught. "Play what?" The girl pointed! A board game sat on the floor. The dice waiting. The board spelled out, "Roll the dice or stay forever." Nathan swallowed hard. He picked up the dice and rolled. The house's game. The board shifted. Letters formed words. Find the door before it finds you. Nathan's heart pounded. What door? Then a new hallway appeared. One that wasn't there before. Nathan ran. Behind him, a creaking sound. He risked a glance back and saw it. A door. Chasing him. Its hinges twisted like bones. Its doorknob turned like a mouth. It wanted to swallow him. Nathan sprinted faster, A second door appeared, then a third. They were closing in. Nathan saw a mirror at the end of the hall, and inside it, the real front door. The only way out. He didn't think. He jumped into the mirror. Chapter 4. The house always wins. Nathan crashed onto cold ground. He gasped, looking around. He was outside. The mansion stood behind him, still and lifeless. Had he escaped? He turned on his phone. It worked. The clock read 7:01 a.m. Nathan laughed. A breathless, broken sound. He made it. He survived. Then, his phone vibrated. A new message. From an unknown number. 4 words. You left something behind. Nathan's blood ran cold. He checked his pockets, his keys, wallet. Everything was there. Then he caught his reflection in the car window and froze, because it wasn't his reflection. It was still in the house, and it was smiling. Nathan turned to run, but the car door slammed shut. The last thing he heard was the house whispering, "You never left." Black screen. The end. Or is it? The House That Dreams. Prologue. The Town That Forgot. There was once a town called Hollow's End, but you won't find it on any map. No one remembers it. No one except the house. Perched on the edge of the dead woods, Blackwood Manor was built in 1887 and abandoned by 1888. In that single year, 23 people vanished inside its walls. No bodies, no blood, just gone. By 1902, the town itself had begun to disappear. Not just the people, the houses, the streets, the records, as if the town had never been there at all. Now, in 2025, one man will step inside. He will find out what happened, and he will pray that the house does not remember him, too. Chapter 1. The Door That Shouldn't Be There. Elliot Graves had spent his life searching for things that shouldn't exist. He wasn't just a filmmaker, he was an obsessive, a collector of lost stories. But Blackwood Manor, no records, no proof. It was as if the house had been erased. That was why, when he found a single handwritten note in an old asylum file, his blood ran cold. It read, "The house dreams. The house remembers. The house does not forget." And beneath that, an address. One that did not exist. But when Elliot entered it into his GPS, the route appeared 4 hours north to a place the world had forgotten. Chapter 2. The House That Breathes. The drive took him into the deep woods, where the trees grew too close and the sky seemed too far away. By the time he reached the end of the dirt road, the sun was setting, and there it was. Blackwood Manor. The house loomed in the dying light, its windows dark and empty. Its walls breathed, expanding and contracting as if alive. Elliot's stomach twisted. He wasn't alone. The house was watching him. And then, as if inviting him in, the front door creaked open. Chapter 3. The Missing Room. Elliot stepped inside. Dust floated in the dim light. The walls were covered in scratched words, deep gouges in the wood. He ran his fingers over one. "The house knows your name." His breath hitched. Then something moved upstairs. He spun, his camera shaking, a shadow at the top of the staircase, and for the briefest moment, Elliot swore it had his face. Chapter 4. The Portraits That Change. The house was wrong. Rooms that should have led to hallways led to nowhere. Doors vanished when he turned his back. And then he found the portraits, each one a painting of a person, their faces twisted in silent screams. But then he saw himself, a new painting, with his eyes missing. A whisper slithered behind him. "It's already painting you." He turned, and the hallway was gone. Chapter 5. The Black Door. Elliot ran through the shifting house. Then he found it. A door, black as coal. The words carved into it sent ice through his veins. No one leaves. His heartbeat thundered. The handle was ice cold beneath his fingers. He turned it, and the door swung open. Chapter 6. The room that should not exist. Inside was a single wooden chair, and sitting in it, Elliot Graves. His own face, his own body, but his mouth was sewn shut. His eyes pleaded with him. Then a voice spoke, not in his ears, inside his head. "You were never supposed to leave." The other Elliot began to laugh, and as the door slammed shut behind him, Elliot realized the truth. The house had been waiting for him, and now it would never forget him. The end. Or is it?